My name is Marcia Eli, and on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Center for Brooklyn History, where we are right now. And it's my joy to welcome you. Tonight is the first in a new series titled Just Conversations, co-presented by the Center for Brooklyn History and Brooklyn.org. Just Conversations brings into dialogue injustices in our borough, city, and society, and gives voice to those who are galvanizing change. Our topic this evening, the impact of medical racism. We are so honored to host two distinguished experts, Dr. Uche Blackstock, whose acclaimed new book, Legacy, A Black Physician Reckons with Racism in Medicine, really helped to catalyze this event. Legacy is on sale at the CBH shop. You probably saw it as you came in. I think some people have already purchased it, and Dr. Blackstock will sign copies following the event. She is joined by another extraordinary change maker, Dr. Aletha Maybank, founding leader for the American Medical Association, AMA's Center for Health Equity. You'll hear more about both of them shortly from our moderator, Jenna Flanagan, but first it's my great pleasure to welcome Brooklyn.org's CEO and President Jocelyn Rainey to say a few words. Jocelyn.
Good evening. Good evening. So thank you, Marcia, and thank you to the entire Center for Brooklyn History team. This institution is truly a jewel in the crown of our Brooklyn Public Library system, and we are so deeply grateful and honored to be in partnership with you for our Just Brooklyn conversations. This is a series to elevate critical issues of racial, social, and economic justice through the stories and insights of brilliant Brooklynites. And tonight, we have two of the fairest Brooklyn-born and bred Black women to take on the medical establishment. Joining us, Dr. Uche Blackstock and Dr. Aletha Maybank. In conversation with acclaimed journalist Jenna Flanagan. I am so excited to learn from them and to be inspired by them, and I know you will be too. As the president and CEO of Brooklyn.org, I have a front row seat to the challenges facing our communities, as well as the brilliance born from our borough. And I can tell you that Brooklyn is not only the cultural capital of New York City, it is also the center of innovation and new ideas. Because we as Brooklynites never settle for the status quo, and that is why Brooklyn.org exists. We are a partner and platform for mobilizing change through the power of local giving, bringing together everyone who loves Brooklyn to harness our collective generosity and match needs with resources, struggles with solutions, and inequity with justice. To make Brooklyn a beacon of what is possible. We all know that there is heartbreaking injustices and indefensible disparities confronting our Brooklyn communities. We also know that change happens. It happens here first because of the strength of our people and our deep commitment to caring for one another. So tonight, this isn't just a conversation. This is a conversation about justice, about the future we all want to build together, and we hope you will join our Brooklyn.org movement to achieve it. If you haven't already, please head to our new home at brooklyn.org and sign up to be part of our future events to learn more about our amazing nonprofits that we back here in Brooklyn, all the issues that they are addressing and we are partnering with them on, and know what you can do to help us to move this. Thank you for coming out tonight. And now I'll pass the mic back to Marcia. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jocelyn. And I want to say that we are working on two of the next Just Conversations, which I hope you'll keep your eyes peeled for, coming up, one in June, the other later in the fall. They're going to be also relevant and powerful and an event that you'll want to be at. So now I am pleased to introduce moderator Jenna Flanagan, who will in turn share more about our speakers. Jenna is the former host of WNET 13's news magazine Metro Focus, where she was a reporter and host from 2016 until the show went off the air in 2023. Prior, Jenna wrote, reported, and produced for WNYC's All Things Considered, was on air at WBGO, Newark Public Radio, and covered, New York can get in Brooklyn, Newark can get a little shout out. Covered state politics for New York Now, the award-winning public affairs show which airs on Albany's PBS station. She currently co-hosts the podcast Laid Off and Looking with her former executive producer Dominic Camilla, and that explores why news media seemingly imploded and if there's any hope in saving the industry and the jobs it created. So, without any further ado, please help me welcome Jenna, Uche, and Aletha to the stage.
Okay, we are on. Okay. So for everyone, first of all, thank you all so much for joining us. This is such an important, critical conversation, although you're here, so I feel like you know that. So first, I want to go in and make sure that we give full introductions to my fabulous two guests. So first, next to me, I have Dr. Aletha Maybach. She is a pediatrician and preventative medicine physician, a public health professional, and a senior vice president with the American Medical Association. As Chief Health Equity Officer, she is the founding leader for the AMA's Center for Health Equity and a recognized speaker, writer, and expert on health equity and racial justice, Dr. Aletha Maybach. Okay, and on the far left from me, I have Dr. Uche Blackstock. Dr. Blackstock is a physician and a thought leader on bias and racism in healthcare. She is the founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity. She appears regularly on MSNBC and NBC News and there's a lot of ands in this, and is a former associate professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine and the former faculty director for recruitment, retention, and inclusion in the Office of Diversity Affairs at NYU School of Medicine, and an author. Let's give it up for Dr. Blackstock. So, ladies, I'd like to start with, I would guess, the headline issue here, and that is, of course, the subject of racism in medicine. And so, for Dr. Blackstock, I want to start with you and just ask, why was this something that you felt deserved a full book to begin with? Like, what was it that inspired you to start writing?
Oh, first I want to say good evening and thank you everyone who came to spend some time with us today. Thank you. So I wrote Legacy because I really wanted to help everyone connect the dots to why we're now in 2024, why we see the appalling, disturbing, unconscionable statistics as they relate to Black health in this country, and that it's not because there is something intrinsically wrong with us, but that there is something very intrinsically wrong with the social institutions in this country that are embedded with racism, that essentially prevent us from living long, full lives. And those are lives that we deserve to be full of love, birthday parties, graduations, retirement parties. We deserve all of that. And I wanted to make sure that even a broad audience understood why, in 2024, even despite advances in innovation, technology, research, right? Even despite that, we still are seeing worsening of life expectancy for Black Americans and other Americans of color, why we still are seeing worsening of maternal mortality and infant mortality, so that people are not making assumptions about there being something, genetically or biologically inferior about us, because that is the easy takeaway from many of the headlines that we see in the news. That's something that even health professionals internalize and believe in it as well. And I needed to make sure that we put the truth out there.
Okay. I do I do also want to clarify for the audience that we did discuss that I could call you both by your first names,
Yeah,
but
of course.
because
Oh, yeah.
I am
Yes.
so honestly, I am so impressed with your resumes and your title. At least for the first one, Dr. Maybach, and then from after that will be Uche and Alita. But so for Dr. Maybach, for you, for the work that you were doing or that you continue to do, especially being like, equity and racial justice leader and, working with the AMA for their health equity, what is it that you have been seeing? Are there patterns that you have been seeing just throughout your career that have indicated to you that perhaps the progress that people might like to think that we have made has not been made?
Thank you for that. It could go so many different ways. I first also want to thank, the invite to be here today. I want to thank Uche. Uche and I, have known each other for a long time. We're friends. We've lived in the same places. I see people I haven't seen in ages when I look out there. I know. Okay. I won't get distracted, but it's a really important point in terms of seeing the people that and being able to support each other in these environments, because doing this work within institutions is very challenging. And so the nature of my work, I am a pediatrician by training, but I shifted into doing public health, and most of my career was spent in governmental public health. AMA is the last 5 years. Prior to that, I was actually assistant commissioner here in Brooklyn. That's right. And then I was deputy commissioner in the New York City Department of Health and started the Center for Health Equity in New York City. And that had generated, thanks y'all, that generated a lot of attention, but it also kind of really shifted me into the space, and under the leadership of Dr. Mary Bassett, who was the commissioner, really allowed me this space to say, all right, we're an institution. What does the institution need to do? So as Uche mentioned, it's the social structures, right? It's not us. We shouldn't be blamed for the bad health we have, but our health is determined by the conditions of which we live. And so our institutions that are in our neighborhoods and our spaces are determining and those things that we have access to or don't have access to. So as a health department, as an example, what is it that a health department needs to do in order to show that they are going to become anti-racist? Right? And that's a whole, story around that. So that's been my work, is working with institutions, those institutions to do organizational change work to advance equity and health equity, not only outside the institution, but inside of it. Because if people are making decisions around health and they don't even understand what equity means, and basically equity means the opportunity for everyone to have optimal health. It's not a hard definition, but the hard part is having the will and the mindset to do something differently and to see something differently that we may not have seen before, so that we don't create inequities and we produce optimal health. And so that's been the nature of my work. And so when I came to the AMA, which is a national organization, a long-standing organization, lots of conversation to be had about the organization, and it has a racist past. It's known to have excluded Black physicians for almost over 100 years. And it really wasn't until civil rights was passed that they had to choose to accept Black physicians fully across the country. And that's just one demonstration. But in terms of your question and what have I noticed over time, the reality is that this narrative about us as Black and brown people being inferior, not being smart enough, saying it's about our biology and not the conditions of which we has been here since the beginning of time, right? The narratives have not changed. They have not. The strategies that are used in order to oppress and keep people down have not changed either, right? And I think we're actually in a time where able to talk about it in a different type of way. I'm not saying we don't get pushback, we can talk about that as well. But I think COVID exposed a lot and offered this opportunity for people to talk about inequities more. My mom now understands what that word is, and she says she understands what I do now. And then also the public murder of George Floyd, I think, like, really propelled this conversation around racism more explicitly. I'm not saying people are fully comfortable with it, but that's the environment that we're in. And because we're in that environment, we see the level of pushback that exists. So that's, I don't feel the conditions in one way have changed. I think it's become hopefully more clear for people, and becomes clearer for people that we can't sit idly by and that we have to organize.
Can I just add that, thank you, Letha, but, for me, as a physician, and I'm a second generation Black woman physician, which is something that, a story that I use in my book Legacy to talk about these larger issues. But for me, even being a second generation Black woman physician, I had so much, and when Aletha was talking, it had me thinking, I had so much unlearning and relearning to do, because there were so many educational gaps in my education, my medical education, and my medical training. And so, under Aletha's leadership, I believe it was the Undesign the Red Line Undesign the Red Line, that exhibit that basically really shows like the impact of the redlining policy on health, that I began to understand even my own community. I grew up in Crown Heights, and in 1977, my parents purchased our home, and they had a very hard time purchasing our home because it was a formerly redlined neighborhood. And the only reason they got the mortgage is because my father was a veteran from the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation. So I'm sure many people in the room know this. And that mission of the organization was to increase home ownership among Black Brooklynites. But I mention that because growing up, I had internalized that there was something, even though I was so proud of my community, I looked around and I was like, why isn't there a grocery store? Why do we have to go out of the neighborhood to go to a grocery store? Why do my parents not feel comfortable sending me to the schools in this neighborhood? Why does my mom have to drive to Prospect Park for there to be, green space for her to run? And so there were all these observations that I was making growing up. I knew my neighborhood was full of beautiful, hardworking people. We were truly a community, and this is when Brooklyn was really a community, where we looked out for each other. Like, where if there was alternate side of the street parking, your neighbor would tell you. Okay, yes. If it snowed, your neighbor would shovel the snow. But again, like, I did not connect the dots until I was much older and, in my training and practicing medicine. And so if that's my journey, you can imagine what the journey is for the majority of people in medicine and other health professions.
All right, so building off of definitely Uche, what you were just saying, but also Aletha, what you were touching on, when we talk about systems, because for example, Uche, if this was something that as a Black child was sort of revealed to you, something that you had to learn, even though you were living and experiencing these inequities yourself, what does that mean for people who are not part of the Black community to have to learn and discover about these things that we are still learning as we're living them? Like, does that create an additional barrier of addressing a problem that, again, this is healthcare. We're talking about life and death. So Aletha, I'll start with you.
Yes. So, I've come to speak to this a lot now in terms of the role of everyone, because what happens, I think, oftentimes is that, and we as Black and brown people are often in these roles of equity and diversity, right? So it's put to us to do this work, right? And I actually don't think that's healthy at all. And I'm starting to question. I just wrote a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine that was published about these roles, and I think the harm that we embody in doing these roles and all the weight that comes with it. And there's a great quote, many of you know Caste now because of Origins. Ava DuVernay turned Isabel Wilkinson's book into a film, and she has a great quote in there that I put at the beginning of all my presentations, and I'm not going to be able to recite it off my head because it's long, but it's about the idea of this, that we're all in this house, right? And this house was built, it's here now, and we all have to deal with what's in it, right? It's not just a few of us, but it's all of us. And so I do believe that we do need more, I don't like the term as much allies, because I think allies oftentimes people interpret that very passively, like they have to be asked to be drawn into the conversation or they wait. I need an accomplice. I need a co-conspirator.
I've heard that word used.
The word that we're doing, and it's true. I think, I'm clear, we as Black and brown people cannot do this and solve this on our own. We can't. We need multiracial coalitions, multi-identity coalitions. We learned, Black Panthers knew that. Like our ancestors, our organizing ancestors have already taught us this. And so we're at a time where how do we inspire that again? And some folks are working on it. Let me be real clear. Folks are already in that space, but I don't think there's enough populace that really understands that context, that the solutions that we need are rooted in will, not even rooted in data. We need data to kind of see accountability and where we're going, but it's really rooted in will. And we need more people to step forward, to step up, to step together in order to push for change within our institutions and outside of our institutions. And that, to me, is the role of white people really very directly. That has not been talked about as much.
I know. I was thinking that we would get to this towards the end. Because remember, we were talking about, okay, what
No,
to
let's
end
start
with.
right now.
No,
Let's go
no,
right
no, no,
into
no.
it.
No, I love it. I've had my own experience within institutions. I was in academic medicine for a very long time. And I write about my journey in legacy of, being in a diversity, equity, and inclusion role towards the end of my tenure there. And like so many of us in these roles, not being fully empowered in the role, being silenced and muzzled in the role, and really it being a radicalizing moment for me, where I was just like, okay, I have a very hard decision to make. I'm either going to stay and be miserable, and not just miserable, but just be in a toxic environment that is not healthy for me. And so I say I made a life-saving decision to leave that environment, and decided that I was just going to leave academic medicine overall, because I felt like while every institution is different, they are all on a continuum of toxicity towards us. So no. So I made the decision to leave, and I continue to work on advancing health equity. We do this work from the outside, but we also often talk about how it's important, there's some of us to do the work on the inside and the outside, but not at the cost of our emotional, psychological, and physical health. Like that I am always like very, very clear about. Because another thing that I wrote about when I left academic medicine, I wrote a piece in Stat News about why Black faculty leave academic medicine. And it was a lot of the similar reasons why we leave other institutions, like just not being supported, not being mentored, not being sponsored, not having a lot of the opportunities that our peers have. And the response that I got from that piece was overwhelming, from so many people that said, you said what I can't say, and not just within medicine, but in other disciplines as well. But one thing that I wrote in that piece is that we are tasked with dismantling these systems that we did not create. And it is so unfair to us, but many of us do it because almost for our survival and and I do it for my children and children's children and and our future generations, because I want them to live in a world that treats us better than we've seen and is currently happening.
So I want us to drill down and get very, very crystal clear on what we're talking about when we say these health inequities. Like, are there examples that you can both give us about how this actually shows up in the real world? Because sometimes when we have these conversations, they can feel somewhat esoteric. And yes, that's a bad thing. But then when it's right in front of you, perhaps you don't recognize what's happening, or you don't know what to do about what you see happening right in front of you.
Sorry. I was listening, I promise. We were.
Yeah.
So what do they? I mean,
We're
there's
just saying
so many-
that we're just saying that there are people in the audience that know the data, but we want to make sure
yeah,
everyone's on the same page.
right. And I was going to say, oh, we should ask people in the audience what inequity, because sometimes. Well, I think one of the big ones, I think that's in the news, and thanks to, when I was at New York City Department of Health and other folks who were there as well, who did a lot of the work around birth equity and maternal equity, almost over 10 years ago now, started to see the data. It wasn't exposed quite, and honestly, that's an institutional choice, right? And then Linda Villarosa, wrote a piece in the New York Times, and it became quite national. The challenge and problem in New York City, but the reality is really it's across this nation of the differences in health outcomes for Black mothers or birthing people, let me say overall, and Black birthing people, and their outcomes as it relates to the folks who are giving birth, as well as for the babies as well. So we were dying at rates at like 8 to 12, something that I don't remember the time. It was like 8 to 12 times more at that time, and that's outrageous. And we're in New York City, a very wealthy city mostly, right? And these are some of the stats. So that's just one example. But I think, and then Uche, you just brought up, and that's kind of the outcome example, right? We know heart disease. Again, Blacks are more likely, as an example, to experience heart disease, to die of heart disease. That's the outcome part of it. But then what are the reasons and conditions that get us there? And so, and Uche mentioned some already in terms of like what's in the neighborhood, what are the jargon term that they use now, the social determinants of health, which is true, right? They are things that are in our neighborhoods, or whether it's our transportation, our housing, the quality of it, economics, what kind of job do you have? I think what's good is we're seeing an evolution from economics to really wealth, and your ability to build wealth actually has a critical role in how well, you can have good health. And we know the data shows that Blacks have less generational wealth and household wealth than whites do by a lot. And so I'll stop there. I'll let Uche take over. I can do more, but I don't want to take up.
No, it's fine.
I'm just saying, and then there are like the fundamental causes, and that's kind of why we're here, and
Yeah.
what we talk about all the time, of why there are those differences in the social determinants of health. So I pass it.
Yeah, no. So all the things that Dr. Maybank said, but also just thinking about, the last few years. So, when we look at life expectancy, which is an indicator of how well people are living, right? We see that compared to other high income countries, the US is doing horribly. And, the US life expectancy was actually going down slightly even before the pandemic started. And since then, and during the height of the pandemic, there was a drop for all high income countries. But other countries have rebounded. We continue to decline. And it's for all racial demographic groups, but mostly for Black and Indigenous people. And so, we have to, there's so many different reasons. And so I often use, I don't know if people have heard of the 4 I's of oppression. It's a way of thinking about systems of oppression. So the one I is ideological, another is internalized, other is interpersonal, and then institutional. And so I think when we think about these outcomes, especially if we're talking about Black birthing people, it's not just about the environment. Also, it's about the environment, right? That has probably the biggest impact, but it's also about what happens when people are interfacing with the healthcare system, right? And health professionals. And we know that there is a pattern of Black patients and other patients of color not being listened to, their complaints being minimized or ignored, and we know that there are implications and consequences of that, and we see that for people who are very high profile. We see that the fact that we are physicians, right, doesn't necessarily protect us as much as our white counterparts. So there's a book called I think it's called Invisible Visits, and the author interviews actually Black middle-class women in focus groups about what they do when they go to the physician or a health professional. And they all talk about how they put on their best outfits. They make sure their hair is done, right? They make sure they share their educational level, right? And you know what? It doesn't make a difference. And so that's why a lot of times people will say, but we're seeing these statistics, it's really just about socioeconomic status. And yes, okay, socioeconomic status plays a role, but racism also plays a role as well. And so I think it's something that these statistics today, right, the fact that Black birthing people in the New York City are 8 to 12 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related complications, it's because of what happens within our healthcare system and within other systems that they have to interact with.
And racism shows up everywhere. And that's one ism. I like the 4 I's because racism can show up in those 4 different ways, right? And
Yes.
when we say isms, I like to break the words down because, sometimes this is a friendly audience and a warm audience and a knowledgeable audience, because I'm sure you all read Uche's book. I hope you did. But, racism is a system, right? It's a system of oppression and power, and it strives to exclude as well as benefit. And that's the system. So people are excluded and people benefit, and it's aligned with a value related to a hierarchy of value based on your skin color. That's the system of racism. So you could do ism for any sexism. It's the same kind of concept, breaking down the term. And these realities exist in our society. So they're going to show up, whether it's education or health or anything. And so how do we really name it is been a large part of the challenge for so long. And again, I have to give credit to, Dr. Mary Bassett, who was here in New York City, who wrote one of the very first pieces. I think it was also in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was Black Lives Matter. It was the time when, there was more escalation, public elevation of police brutality. It's been going on since the beginning of time. But now, with phones, people are, videotaping it. So she wrote a piece called Black Lives Matter and really set that kind of tone and foundation that we need to name racism as a fundamental cause of why the health inequities in this country, at least the greatest gaps in this country, exist.
Wait, I lost my train of thought. I was so enraptured by what you were saying. I was going to say that, one of the statistics that I use to demonstrate just, how much work needs to be done, and you talked about infants, is the fact that, the Black-white disparity in infant mortality is wider today. So Black infants are more than twice as likely to die in the first year of life than white infants today. And that is a greater disparity than 15 years before the end of slavery. So while overall infant mortality rates were higher in the mid 1800s, and there have been improvements because of sanitation, just innovation and technology, those overall rates for all babies have improved, the disparity has widened. And so I think that speaks so much about our priorities as a country.
Especially now. I mean, and if you go down south, those disparities gaps are even greater. And they're closing down all their maternity and we see here in New York City, right? In certain places and in certain neighborhoods, North and Central Brooklyn, South Bronx, East and Central Harlem, all the places, I used to oversee, those hospitals are closing down. That boggles my mind. I'm like, where are people supposed to go? Right. And it's happening even more so, I think, in the South. And so that's a representation too about prioritization of investment and money and where it goes, and who, also speaks to who has the power to make those decisions, because I honestly believe if the people in power were losing in that way, that wouldn't happen in their community. It doesn't happen in white communities as much. It just doesn't. And so I'll stop there because that evolves to something else.
Our friend Jonathan Metzl, he wrote what's his book? What's his book called?
Dying of Whiteness.
Dying of Whiteness. But he talked about how white Americans, especially rural and low-income white Americans, will vote for policies that vote against policies that would actually benefit them, like Medicaid expansion, right? Because they know that those policies could also benefit Black and brown people.
And that's the lie that's been told, right? And that's the consistent lie that's been told,
and the scarcity
that
mindset.
Somebody's going to take from you.
Right.
Right? And those others, the othering, the myth of meritocracy, right? This idea that you can pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And I'm from the West, my family's Caribbean as well. And we used to hear that, we worked how many jobs, da, da, da. But the reality is that there are many people who work 2 to 3 jobs and they are not acquiring, and they work hard.
Well,
And they're not acquiring the same wealth. And so there's these myths and these lies and falsehoods that get told. Many of us believe them still in this room, and we don't even realize it. And we perpetuate it.
Right. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about the racial wealth gap and how we got here, because that was, Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley talks about policy violence. And it's so, and when you think it's so profound, thinking about, the legacy of redlining, the legacy of the GI Bill, and that, Black returning World War II veterans were not able to utilize the housing provision of that because they were not able to, they were not given mortgages to live in their neighborhoods, and they were discriminated against from living in white neighborhoods. And then other aspects of the, FDR's program,
The New Deal?
the New Deal in terms of the development of the suburbs. Like when we think about what suburbs look like, they are mostly white. That's what we see. That's what we saw on TV, and they're mostly white because there was language in the deed covenant saying these structures cannot be sold to Black families, and you cannot resell them to Black families. So all of this is just so critically important to understanding, why our communities look the way they look today, to understanding the chronic disinvestment. That's what I was seeing growing up in Crown Heights. I was seeing the chronic disinvestment in my community. So of course, when we look at, the redlining map and current day health inequities, and we look at if the neighborhood hasn't been gentrified, we see that, those are the same neighborhoods with the highest maternal mortality rates or infant mortality rates or highest asthma rates, right? Like this is not a surprise. But these are concepts that I think even most health professionals don't know, don't understand, are not being taught. And that really need to be considered. Like when we're in a room with our patient, I always say it's not just my patient and me, it is their family, it's their employer, it's what's happening in their neighborhood, what's going on in their church. Like all of that impacts how healthy they are.
And can I say something?
Oh, no, as I'm listening to all of this, I'm realizing, so if I'm understanding correctly, it's not just majoring in pre-med, it's pre-med / sociology at this point?
No, it's a perfect point, and that's exactly where I was going to go,
Right.
because that's been, I think, one of the greatest losses within this country is the understanding of what creates health. And what creates health, right? It's a lot, right? So we already talked about there are the structures and the systems. So there's the policies and laws. What impacts policies and laws? Politics, right? So we laugh, but that means that's why we have to be engaged in politics, because politics influence policies. It structures every single thing that we do, every single thing that we do. There is not anything that's not structured by laws and policies, barely. And culture actually responds to that. In addition, values also, based on who's in power, produce policies as well, based on what they want to see, if that makes sense. And so this concept of what creates health is broad, right? There are the commercial determinants of health. Daniel Dawes wrote The Political Determinants of Health, if you want another really fascinating read as well. And so this gap in knowledge, in part, comes from the medical community and is driven from the medical community. And so I'm at the American, somebody said a yes. I'm at the American Medical Association. In 1910, there was a report that was published called the Flexner Report. And this report was commissioned by the AMA and funded by several foundations. So this is the interesting thing too.
Including the Carnegie Foundation.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
There you go. She's gonna name them for me. This is a teamwork right here. Like, I love it. So, and that's the important part, is that folks didn't operate in isolation, right? Power doesn't operate in isolation. They are working together to keep power in particular ways. And so they were funded to do this report. Abraham Flexner was associated with Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins had this German model of teaching that was very rooted in research, basic science, and it was very profit driven. And so at that time, the physicians who were making up AMA started launched in 1847, really wanted to take hold of medicine, right? And they create, AMA is still one of the most powerful lobbies in healthcare to this day in terms of creating structures within the context of medicine. And so in what the ask was for Abraham Flexner to go around to every medical school. And at that time, they had a couple, there were at least 1,000 med schools. There were lots of med schools at that time. And he was to go around and kind of assess the rigor of the med school. So in his assessment, the majority of med schools actually shut down, is one outcome. And there was the decision that med school and medicine should be based on the basic and clinical sciences, not on the social. It really took the social context of health out. And many who were doing social medicine were considered quackery medicine. And the other really big implication of the Flexner report, at that time, there were Black medical schools, way more than there are now. And as a result of the report, 5 of the 7 Black med schools shut down, and only 2 were left, Meharry and Howard. And you can see, and there are only 4 really now at this particular time as well. And so that has implications to this day on the number of Black physicians that we see in medicine, which is still pretty low. The numbers are still pretty low. So I say all that to say is that there's this history is really critical, I think, to understand in order to, one, fight against it and not to have it repeat itself. And we see this moment of it repeating because with all the anti-DEI movement and all this interest to stop history, these are the things that we're not learning. We already didn't even know our history, but we're really not going to know our history. And that just you just end up repeating the same kind of mistakes over and over again and creating harm over and over again.
Yeah, and I would just say, while we're on the Flexner report, even the recent SCOTUS decision on race-conscious admissions, we have to think about what is the domino effect of that going to be, right? Because even the Flexner report, the Journal of American Medical Association in 2020, actually, they published an article which estimated that if those 5 historically Black medical schools had remained open, they would have trained educated between 25,000 and 35,000 Black physicians. When I read that, I write in Legacy about this, I cried. Because I cried to think about just not just a loss of brain potential, but the impact on our communities, the tens or hundreds of thousands of patients they would have cared for, the students and trainees they would have mentored, the research that they would have done, and that's what racism does, right? That is the impact of racism, this erasure of all that potential. And so that's why I think we have to know the history to also know where we are today, to know where we're going to go. Because if we have this policy now in higher education where schools don't feel comfortable. They're scared. They're worried about legal action if they're considering race and even in a holistic way, right? That is going to impact what our future health professionals look like, right? And unless we come up with other ways. So there's a medical school, there's UC Davis, I believe. They said they're just going to use socioeconomic status. But we already know that just using socioeconomic status, you actually are going to miss out on race as well. And so these are the things that we need to understand. We need to understand this history vitally. And, Flexner report, I had not heard about until I was in residency. Yeah. And so again, there's so much you would expect so many physicians to know about this, and it actually impacted other professions, like nursing profession as well,
and public health.
And public health, yeah, and there's another policy, another example of policy violence, the Shepard-Towner Act from the 1920s, essentially medicalized obstetrics and gynecology. It was this effort by physicians to portray midwifery as unsanitary. even though the data then actually showed that midwife assisted, delivery was actually safer. But it essentially put up all of these barriers to people getting, certified to become midwives. And after that policy was enacted, we've seen a decrease in all midwives, white midwives, and specifically Black midwives. And so, when we look at these statistics today, we look at why they're less than 3% of Black physicians are Black women, less than 6% are Black. Right? There are reasons for this. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with us. There's nothing. There is something very, very wrong with our systems.
Yeah, and across so many industries, just from the work that I've had a chance to do, I am constantly reminded of the just millions and millions of missed opportunities and missed talent, if you will, that was never nurtured.
Can I just share? Because legacy is a love letter to my mother, the original Dr. Blackstock, Dr. Dale Gloria Blackstock, who also grew up in Central Brooklyn. But I write about her because there are so many other children like her that grew up in Central Brooklyn in the 50s and 60s that could have made it to Harvard Med. My mom made it to Harvard Med because she had a chemistry professor at Brooklyn College, a Black man, who saw her potential and encouraged her to apply to medical school. Okay? Yes. And after Harvard Med School, she came back and trained here and worked in the community in which she grew up in. And that was my role model, right? But I think about all the other children that grew up with my mom, right? That because of racism, because of poverty, did not have the access or awareness of these opportunities. And what a loss it is for not just our communities, but our cities, our country. Like racism harms in such a way that we can't even quantify it.
Absolutely not. I do want to talk about your journey to becoming a doctor, because you also talk about that in the book. And that's also something that can prevent a lot of young, especially African-American children or just Black children in America from being able to even get their MD.
Yeah, I definitely think, we know representation is part of it. It's not all of it, but it definitely is part of it. And I didn't recognize this very unique, rare experience that I was having growing up, but my twin sister Oni and me, to have a mother that was a physician. Not only that, but my pediatrician was a Black woman, Dr. June Mulvaney. Yes. And my mother was the president of our local Black woman organization, Dr. Susan Smith Stewart McKinney Society. So she would bring my twin sister and me to those meetings when we were kids. We would be in the back of the room just listening in at these brilliant women, organizing and doing work in service to our community. So that is the perspective that I grew up with. And so when I get to Harvard Med, I'm like, wait, where's everybody? Right? Because those weren't the percentages at that time, So I felt, obviously I'm so, we lost our mom to acute myelogenous leukemia when she was only 47. She was so a year older than me. She was 46, the age I am now when she was diagnosed. And I write about how she led a very healthy life. Like she made, in terms of the individual choices she made about what she ate, and she ran every day. She picked up running in medical school, but also, the type of leukemia that our mother had, when she was getting her treatment, one of her oncologists said, when we look at your chromosomes, they look like you were exposed to radiation as a child. And when we look back at the neighborhoods that my mom grew up in, even though she had to move a lot because of housing insecurity, there were Superfund sites very, very close to where our mother grew up. And the kind of leukemia that she developed, the myelodysplastic syndrome, is something very rare for Black women to develop at her age. It's usually older white men. So there are all these things I think about. We talk about environmental racism, right? Our neighborhoods being, more likely to be sites of toxic dumping, and how the implications of that for our health.
In terms of my journey, So I mentioned already that my family is from Antigua in the Caribbean, and so I grew up actually in Harrisburg. We were talking about this earlier about black children who grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods, and so I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She would actually, so this is fascinating. So my parents met at Bed-Stuy Restoration when it opened. So my mom was an administrative, so she came here to Brooklyn first with the family because that's how it goes. And she was an administrative assistant, so she would see Robert F. Kennedy come in, and she would tell stories about. But my parents met because of Bed-Stuy Restoration. I'm here because of that, right? And so Brooklyn has always been very important to me, but I never realized that until later on, in life. And so I grew up and was born in Pennsylvania. Predominantly, it's not a new story. There are many folks who have experienced it. But what I learned is from my mother. And I learned advocacy is first and foremost, because all throughout, there were so many folks putting forward that narrative, the teachers, the school, that, Aletha, I remember they put me in like a remedial reading class in third grade. And my mother, got a tutor, and my mom's brilliant. Like my mom's, she's just brilliant. She got a tutor, and the tutor said, "There's nothing wrong with Aletha." I remember Beverly clearly is the first time I read, Ramona the Brave. And that's, it's so me too. And, but she said, there's nothing wrong with, she's just bored by what she's reading, and people aren't paying attention to her in those critical ways. And so, then it was in high school, I knew that the trajectory that they were putting me on as a school was not going to get me where I wanted to go. My cousins were at Hopkins and all these places, and I knew I needed to get there. And so I doubled up. My mom had to sign in 12th grade that if I failed AP English, that it wasn't their fault. Like nobody else had. We still have this paper on record. And then my final week of high school, I got into Hopkins undergrad. There was the first multicultural day at the school. I was excited because we never had this. Of course, they put me in charge of the African American table because I'm the leading African American, in the school. And so somebody brought a letter and said, "Beware, racism still exists." I went to school with skinheads and children of KKK. So they were always there, always present. I was always teased, everything. So this, day, we put it out on the table. The principal came around, and everything was fine. The next day I get called to the principal's office, and apparently the skinheads came and said, well, if they're not allowed to pass out their paraphernalia, why are we allowed to pass out ours? So he thought the equitable thing to do was to give me in-school suspension. My last 3 days of high school, I was in school suspension. I kid you not. And what I recall, one, is my mother's consistent and persistent advocacy and what it means to show up for people. I get it one context for the children, but just for people in general, that's who she is. I also learned from my mom the context of proximity. My mom is one of those folks who, I was always in people's homes, and she was always kind of giving, but not in almost like she was friending everybody. Like it was really, but in a good way, but giving all at the same time. So I learned different folks, like all kinds of folks, different racial backgrounds in their homes. Proximity is really critical for us to understand and see the humanity in each other. And we don't have enough of it, truthfully. And then the other part that I learned was that if systems and structures and people who are leading those systems and structures do not want me to succeed, they're going to do whatever it takes in order to do so. So that's where my lessons kind of foundationally were learned. I did not know I was going to end up in this space, but I realized that a lot of my context comes from there. And so I decided to do pediatrics. I got a Fisher-Price doctor kit, and I always wanted to do pediatrics. And then when I went through medicine, then I became disenchanted to some level, and the system, I didn't appreciate being told the social worker should take care of something and pay attention to my patients and what they had access to, and I shouldn't. And so I was, I finished my Peds residency and then found preventive medicine, public health, and that's really my space and where I've been.
Okay. We are almost running out of time, but before we go to our Q&A section of this, I do want to ask you both your perspective. For everyone in the audience, we've got a beautiful mosaic of humanity. What do you recommend that people can do? And given what we've heard about the weight that Black women are already carrying, what can everybody else do?
Okay, so that's like a conversation in its own, right? Like that's another 2 hours. But as you know, in chapter 15 of the book, I have a call to action to different groups. And as I've said here this evening, we've done a lot of work and we are so exhausted, and our patients are dying, and so I don't know how much more of our humanity that we have to share. But one thing I do say is that sometimes I think people feel very overwhelmed by the problems, right? And the statistics are overwhelming. In Legacy, I talk about a birthing center in Minneapolis called the Roots Birth Center. And it's founded by a Black midwife. And they've done really beautiful, wonderful work. Literally, the mission of the birthing center is to give dignified and respectful care. Like that's the mission, right? To see the person as a full human being. And they've actually been able to show that they've improved maternal complications, preterm deliveries. They're doing really beautiful work. I think we need to look at what's happening hyperlocal and locally. What's happening in neighborhoods adjacent or near yours that are Black people, Black women-led efforts. We need to amplify the work that they're doing. We need to support them, donate. Do whatever we can in our own respect. These are from the white folks in the audience. Look at what's happening in your areas, maybe not in your neighborhood, but in Black neighborhoods or neighborhoods of color that are close by, because we have a lot of the solutions already. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Dr. Maybank talked about the Black Panthers. Like, they literally were practicing structurally competent care in the late 60s with free health clinics, with free breakfast giveaways, providing legal assistance, doing sickle cell testing. Like, we need to think about how do we take care of communities holistically. And a lot of the solutions, they are there. They need funding, they need amplification, they need to be replicated. Those models need to be replicated elsewhere.
And to speak to maternal or birthing supports of all types, there's a whole community here in Brooklyn. I'm sure some folks are in this audience. That is one of the eye-opening opportunities and privileges that I got from being an assistant commissioner, was just meeting the wonderful leaders, Black women leaders, who are doing so much to ensure that we are able to survive as well as thrive in our families. So I just, if there's anything, even Brooklyn, I almost said museum, sorry. Where are we? Brooklyn. Thank you. Center for Brooklyn History, thank you. Can do and support is elevating and helping people get access to those that context and those resources that are right here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is so rich with a lot of activity. I will say also, though, we're coming in this election year, and voting is important at all point in times. And I'm not going to say simply just voting, but I think we need to understand our issues better. And we need to, and not everybody, I don't want to take for granted that everybody can read, because that's not true for many different reasons. But I do think we need to be in conversation, proximity. Community and organizations are actually relevant for a very good reason. We do need to be close to each other and learn from one another. And I think we have to push. I think COVID kind of, and I understand, I'm an introvert, so I loved sitting on my couch, and not having to be bothered.
You're an
but
introvert?
I really am an introvert. I kid you not. This is all facade. But my point is that I think folks got really comfortable being with themselves. So as we kind of warm up in this environment, let's try to be in community, proximity with each other, talking about good stuff, because I believe in joy and rest. I saw Bill Jordan back there. See him? I know he's going to hate that I did that. He's on my team. But we're doing a lot around this concept, context of joy and rest and justice. Like, we deserve to have that too. But we need to talk about these issues. We critically need ourselves. to be in solidarity during this time and to be active and engaged and present.